Scott Turner was fined $3,500 by his HOA simply for working remotely in his own home. Behind the charge stood Margaret Flint, a controlling HOA president with a grudge against government types. But what she didn't know was that Scott was a senior state tax auditor with the power to expose her board's financial misdeeds. Just wait until you hear how this quiet professional turned the tables and why justice ultimately prevailed. When Scott Turner first moved into Willow Creek Estates, he believed he was buying peace of mind. The neighborhood advertised itself as private, quiet, ideal for professionals. That was exactly what Scott wanted. His new place wasn't flashy, just a single-story ranch with a broad front porch and a small garden. But one room in particular mattered to him, the spare bedroom, which he carefully converted into a home office. He installed a standing desk, dual monitors, a lockable file cabinet. After all, working from home was now standard in his role as a tax auditor for the state. Scott wasn't running a storefront or inviting customers in. His days were spent poring over spreadsheets and conducting secure video calls with other state agencies. His neighbors rarely saw him outside except for a morning walk or the occasional grocery run. Then, 2 months after moving in, it happened. One crisp Tuesday morning, Scott found a bright red envelope wedged between the slats of his mailbox. The header read, Willow Creek Homeowners Association, Notice of Fine. Curious, he opened it at the kitchen counter and nearly dropped the letter. A fine of $3,500. The stated violation? Operating a business on residential property without prior HOA approval. Scott read the sentence twice, then a third time. His first instinct was confusion. Surely this was a mistake. He wasn't operating a business. He was fulfilling his normal employment obligations in line with the state's hybrid work directive. But as the realization sank in, confusion gave way to unease. Someone in the HOA had either completely misunderstood his work or was intentionally targeting him. Scott picked up the phone and called the number listed on the notice. It rang twice before a clipped voice answered. Willow Creek HOA, this is Margaret Flint. Margaret Flint. The HOA president, an imposing woman in her late 50s, known around the neighborhood for patrolling in a white golf cart, notebook in hand. Scott had met her once, briefly, during move-in. She'd made it clear she valued order and standards above all else. Hi, this is Scott Turner, he began evenly. I just received a notice of fine for allegedly operating a business from my home. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm a state employee working remotely. I'm not running a private business. Margaret didn't miss a beat. You can argue it at the compliance hearing, Mr. Turner, she interrupted coolly. Rules are rules. If we start making exceptions, next thing you know, there'll be hair salons and dog groomers on every street. Scott tried to respond, but she ended the call without another word. For a long moment he stood there with the phone in his hand, staring at the now ominous red envelope on the counter. This wasn't just a case of someone making a simple error. It was something else, an intentional move, the kind of petty power play that left unchecked could escalate fast, and Scott had no intention of letting it slide. The compliance hearing was scheduled for a Thursday evening in the small HOA clubhouse. Scott arrived early, dressed sharply in a navy blazer and crisp shirt. In one hand, he carried a neatly organized folder, copies of the state's work-from-home statute, the Department of Revenue's official remote work policy, and a summary of relevant federal employment protections. He wasn't here to argue emotionally. He had facts, and he intended to present them clearly. Inside, the room was set like a tribunal. At the front, a long table faced a row of folding chairs. Behind the table sat 3 people, HOA President Margaret Flint at the center, flanked by 2 board members, Jack Reynolds, a retired contractor with a permanent scowl, and Paula Green, who wore an expression of polite disinterest. Margaret greeted Scott with a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mr. Turner, she said, motioning to a chair. Scott nodded and sat. As he opened his folder, preparing to distribute copies of the legal documents, Margaret raised her hand dismissively. That won't be necessary, she said. The board has already reviewed the matter and reached a decision. Scott's brow furrowed. Already reviewed? The hearing hadn't even begun. Margaret continued, voice cool and controlled. The fine stands. We have photographic evidence of your vehicle being present during business hours. She slid a blurry printout across the table, an ordinary shot of his car in the driveway. Furthermore, we have received multiple reports from neighbors regarding business activity taking place at your residence. This conduct is considered disruptive to the character of the community. Scott kept his expression neutral, but inside his frustration churned. Photographic evidence, his car, in his own driveway, on a weekday, and multiple reports. From whom? He barely knew his neighbors. No one had visited his home for business because there was no business being conducted. This wasn't about disruption. It wasn't about maintaining community standards. It was about control. As Margaret spoke, Scott recalled something she had said casually during a neighborhood meet and greet weeks earlier, a conversation he'd almost forgotten. I've worked hard to keep the state's fingers out of Willow Creek. We handle our own affairs here. Now it was crystal clear. Margaret saw his role as a state tax auditor as a threat. To her, any symbol of government presence, however benign, was an intrusion on her carefully curated sense of authority. And Scott? He was the perfect target. A quiet professional, new to the neighborhood, easy to paint as an offender. Margaret's real goal wasn't community harmony. It was to make an example of him. To remind everyone who truly held the reins in Willow Creek Estates. Scott felt his jaw tighten. The urge to argue, to confront, flared, but he forced it down. Not here, not now. Because beneath the irritation, a colder, sharper resolve had formed. These board members were abusing their positions. Worse, they were doing it with smug certainty, believing that no one would challenge them. But what Margaret and her allies didn't know was this. They had picked the wrong person to corner, and Scott Turner was about to show them exactly how wrong they were. Scott didn't pay the fine. He also didn't waste time arguing further with Margaret or the board. He knew their kind. Once entrenched in their position, they rarely backed down in public. But there was a deeper weakness, Scott suspected, one they clearly didn't expect him to find. Under state law, all homeowners associations that collect dues and manage community assets must operate as registered nonprofit entities. And nonprofits, by law, are required to maintain transparent, documented financial records, available for inspection upon request by members. Scott sent a formal written request to the HOA board, a complete copy of Willow Creek HOA's financial disclosures for the past 3 years. The response? Silence. Days passed, then a brief email from Margaret. Your request is being reviewed. The board will provide what is appropriate. What followed next was a letter, not from the board, but from an HOA-retained attorney. The letter warned Scott against abusive records requests and threatened additional penalties and legal action if he persisted. That, Scott realized, was Margaret's second mistake, because she still hadn't bothered to ask the most important question: who exactly is Scott Turner? She saw only a state employee working from home. What she hadn't learned, and what Scott had no obligation to advertise, was that he wasn't just any state employee. He was a senior auditor with the Department of Revenue, with clearance to initiate reviews of all registered nonprofit entities across the state, including local HOAs. And now, Margaret had not only triggered a personal vendetta, she had also triggered a legitimate audit flag with her stonewalling. On a quiet Friday afternoon, Scott filed an internal request through official channels. He didn't need to make it personal. The process spoke for itself. Within days, the department's audit unit approved the request. Willow Creek HOA was scheduled for a full compliance review, not just for tax filings, but for proper governance, accurate financial reporting, and lawful use of member dues. The audit began swiftly. Scott, in accordance with his role, received access to the submitted documentation. What he uncovered exceeded even his suspicions. The HOA's records were a mess, thousands of dollars in unreported income from community event fees, money that should have been disclosed and taxed, reimbursements to board members for expenses that lacked any supporting documentation. personal travel, unexplained consulting fees, nearly $20,000 in missing or unverifiable expense records over a 3-year span. The more Scott reviewed, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't simple mismanagement. It was deliberate, sloppy misuse of funds, shielded by the assumption that no one would ever scrutinize them. Armed with this information, Scott escalated his findings through the department's chain of command. Under state law, the penalties for such violations could be severe: substantial fines, back taxes, and in serious cases, revocation of nonprofit status. The audit report was formally filed, and soon after, a certified letter from the state arrived at Willow Creek HOA's mailbox. Word spread quickly. Margaret Flint received official notice that her board and its finances were now under active state investigation. Almost overnight, her visible presence in the neighborhood vanished. Neighbors who had grown used to seeing her golf cart circling the streets reported something unusual. The golf cart sat unused in her driveway. Margaret's once daily patrols had stopped. Because now it wasn't a homeowner she had to intimidate. Now it was the state. And Margaret was about to learn what real accountability looked like. 4 weeks later, the formal findings landed. The state issued a notice of deficiency to Willow Creek HOA. The letter was precise and unambiguous: failure to report taxable income, improper reimbursements, missing financial records, and indicators of potential fraud pending further investigation. Attached was a summary of penalties and back taxes owed, figures that would strain the HOA's modest budget. The audit had reached a depth from which there would be no quiet escape. The board called an emergency meeting in the clubhouse, but this time the atmosphere was different. Gone was the smug certainty. The folding chairs were filled with uneasy faces, neighbors murmuring in low tones, board members shuffling papers nervously. At the front of the room, Margaret Flint stood noticeably less composed. Her usual commanding posture was replaced with a nervous edge. The file she carried trembled slightly in her grip. When Scott arrived, invited by legal requirement, the room grew noticeably quieter. Margaret cleared her throat and forced a strained smile. "Mr. Turner," she began, voice thin, "perhaps we got off on the wrong foot. Surely this situation can be resolved without further escalation." She glanced quickly at her fellow board members, then back at Scott. "I didn't intend for things to become so out of hand." Scott regarded her calmly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I'm required to follow state procedure," he said evenly. "I suggest the board fully cooperate with the audit. And for the record—" He held her gaze. "I have thoroughly documented the HOA's retaliation against me for lawful employment. If there is any further attempt to interfere, I will have no choice but to escalate the matter to the Attorney General's office." Margaret's face paled. The words hung in the air, final and immovable. She opened her mouth to respond, but found no words. The room remained silent. The next weeks unfolded quietly but decisively. The HOA, under legal counsel, withdrew all fines previously levied against Scott. They issued a formal written apology, which Scott received and filed appropriately. The board also notified members that a series of financial reforms were being implemented, including hiring an independent auditor. And Margaret Flint? She resigned from her position, citing personal reasons. Her once frequent presence in the neighborhood all but disappeared. As for Scott, he returned to his peaceful routine. His home office remained unchanged, his work conducted as it always had been, diligent, professional, and entirely lawful. But now, when neighbors saw him on his morning walks, they greeted him with a new tone, one of respect. In a community where petty rules had long gone unchecked, one quiet tax auditor had demonstrated the power of knowing the system and using it wisely. No bluster, no grandstanding, just smart, steady justice. By the book.